Now, here is Ticky Fullerton on Your Money.
Hello there, I'm Ticky Fullerton, every night bringing you a full hour of the very best in business coverage across the nation and internationally. Happy International Women's Day. Coming up, very special conversation for IWD with Vogue Australia editor Edwina McCann on what women want and how she has steered the high fashion magazine into the digital age. Donald Trump's former campaign manager Paul Manafort handed a 47-month prison term. He could have got 20 years, apparently. All the latest on US politics with White House watcher Ed Blakely, just back from the States. And what to make of Huawei's legal action against the US government, where national interest becomes as much about global market share as it does about national security. The Australian's tech guru Chris Griffith explains. Well, now look, taking a back step and looking at things for a moment, we have had the most extraordinary week on the industrial relations front, haven't we? Really, the past year it's been a non-subject, the government not wanting to mention the war, work choices, and then IR Minister Michaelia Cash in bucket loads of trouble over that union raid, handing the portfolio to Kelly O'Dwyer, who promptly retired from politics. But what a change this week. Now, our regular viewers will know that I've been banging on about how significant the ascendancy of industry super is in Australia and the idea that union representatives on the boards would be pushing these funds to use their leverage on corporate Australia to raise wages, an idea that is exercising the minds of every listed company boardroom around the country, you'd think. Well, here's Australian super chair Heather Ridout at the AICD Governance Conference on Monday this week.
We will not be dragged into industrial relations. The representatives of the unions and employers, when they walk through the door of the boardroom in Australian Super, they take off their hat and they become a trustee of Australian Super, and they have a fiduciary duty to the members of the fund. And as a chair of that fund, and I mean, I must say, I've always seen the hats taken off. It's been a very successful discussion.
I tell you, Heather, I spoke to Innes Willocks this week, who's on your board. He's got very strong views about the fact that the ACTU and wages shouldn't be anywhere near this. Dan Walton, also on your board, AW, completely different idea.
Yeah.
So.
Well, they can have their views. They're cats and dogs, employers and unions. and I think, frankly, the government is relying on that. The government doesn't like the trade union movement. They probably absolutely, you know, it's kind of antithetical to everything that they believe in, that the union movement would have some influence, a degree of influence over you know, a very sizable $1 trillion plus in assets. But, you know, you have to trust the governance model. You have to trust the ethics and integrity. You have to trust the regulators.
Well, that's really where it all started, I think. And at the AFR Business Summit on Wednesday, Labour leader Bill Shorten hailed that wages would be the key battleground for the next election. Not economic management, not Manus Island, not anything else. He called for a so-called living wage to replace the minimum wage. Now, the timing for that is still unclear, but wealth inequality is what so many people are talking about. One portfolio manager at the AFR Summit actually called out how some in management have been allowed to basically take profits they didn't deserve, pointing to the large write-downs that go on when a new CEO takes over. Kate Howitt from Fidelity International said the board has been too weak on the outgoing CEO and allowed them to deliver an excessive profit, and then too weak on the incoming CEO, allowing them to clear the decks and set the bar lower for themselves. This is an ethically challenged value transfer from shareholders to management, and it should not happen if the board is engaged. Well, coming after Hayne and the gouging by some in the big end of town, there was also a lot of talk about whether we're in a per capita recession. All this plays into pressure from activists, not just unions, but others from the ESG activist side who successfully lobbied on diversity, successfully lobbied on climate change. Is business going to face a new wave of pressure for rate hikes, which might reset how shareholders think about their returns? Here's former Labour Minister for Superannuation and chair of new super startup Household Capital, Nick Sherry.
You're investing long term, you've got to keep an eye on these long-term factors.
Like wealth inequality.
Like socially responsible investment, like wealth inequality. which is driving a backlash in a range of ways in our society, which I would argue undermines the capitalist system. So my central argument would be trustees should be keeping a very close eye on these factors.
So you'd put that up there with returns?
Yes, because if you don't, you're going to weaken the capitalist system. And I believe in a capitalist market economy that is working efficiently and effectively for all, for everyone. And I would argue a trustee has that fiduciary duty.
Yeah, Nick Sherry put it so well there. Could this wages push really threaten investment in business? Or is this more that directors of companies must come to understand that for the long term, not facing up to wealth inequality, the new moral challenge of our time, is just not good for business in the long term? It's going to be a very interesting year, particularly if Labor make government in May. All right, International Women's Day. Happy IWD, everyone. We thought what better person to talk to than a hugely successful business leader who's worked her way up through, up very tough and exciting business of fashion magazines. Tough because, apart from anything else, it's a long-time reliance on advertising. Editor-in-Chief of Vogue Australia, Edwina McCann, has steered the iconic fashion magazine into the tech age, growing her very precious young audience with online Vogue fashion night outs and Vogue Code, which is a first across Vogue worldwide, I think. Here she is. Edwina McCann, great treat to have you here on International Women's Day. Tell us about your current issue and what you make of Julie Bishop.
So Julie Bishop's actually written for our current issue, along with two other female politicians, about, I guess, the glass ceiling, if you like, with a wonderful cartoon of the red shoe.
Indeed.
Julie, look, I grew up in a world writing fashion, actually, on The Australian, where, fashion was women's issues, and a healthy interest in fashion and intelligence were taken as two mutually exclusive things. So to have...
Well, it's not now. It's quite cerebral.
Absolutely. And I think if you look at French politics, for example, or even American, it's been like that for quite some time. But Julie Bishop's really been the first to quite proudly stand up and say, no, I love my fashion and I do care a lot about, the way I look, but I'm also, an intelligent woman and
yeah, and in fact, I'm going to use it for me.
Absolutely, and it did work remarkably well for her. I think for a long time, Australian female politicians have felt like they want to look like everybody else. But I actually don't know that we want our politicians to look like us, that we want our leaders to look like us. I think what Julie did incredibly well was look very presidential. And people like.
Well, it's funny you should use that word because they're, that's the other thing. Once the Queen passes, who knows?
That's it. And look, a lot can be said with a wardrobe. You can say a lot with what you wear. So she knew that and used it very well. So,
Edwina, you started, I think, at Vogue, didn't you? The beginning of your career. Is that right?
I did.
You're now back running it. You chair Australian fashion. Tell me a little bit about your readership, how that's changed, and how you've responded to that.
So when I first worked at Vogue in the 1990s, and I was there for 7 years, obviously it was only a print title. It had a circulation of about, I think it was 50 to 60,000. So it was very similar to where the print product sits today. Our circ, remarkably, and mainly because we are an entry point luxury good, really, where it's something that people like to keep on their coffee table, and we're not as disposable as some of the weekly magazines who've been under extreme circulation pressure.
Well, there's been carnage over the last decade, hasn't it?
Absolutely, it really has. And a lot of the circulation models, if you like, have been particularly challenged. We really were based on ad revenue. So if you liken it to, it doesn't necessarily matter if you're not reaching 5 million women, if you are reaching the 5,000 who can afford the Chanel jacket at X dollars, that's equally important in terms of environment.
Or just might want to one day, or just dream about it.
Exactly. And I think what's changed, having come back to Vogue in the digital age, was it was actually a remarkable opportunity to extend our audience in ways that I could not have imagined in the beginning of my career. So we now have, well over 2 million following us on social media. Social media is a very important catchment for us to drive consumers to events that we run, which is diversified our income streams.
So things like the fashion night out, the Vogue fashion night out.
So we have 200,000 people in the CBD of Sydney. It's bigger than the Boxing Day sales now. We have about 180,000 in Melbourne.
And you have retailers offering discounts? That
Absolutely.
works for you?
We work with American Express as our mainline sponsor, and they have some incredible offers for people on the evening. And every retailer sort of puts on champagne and treats you like a Vogue VIP, if you like. We have music, entertainment. We really bring the city to life.
Yeah. And what about Vogue codes? Because that goes into, yet another space.
It does. So Vogue Codes is now 3 years old, and I'm incredibly proud of this because it is an Australian invention, if you like, an Australian creation that Condé Nast are looking at extending internationally now. It was born out of a conversation I actually had with McCann Brooks about how he was struggling to find young women to come in specifically to the programming departments, but also just broadly into the tech sector. Exactly. It's all a result of STEM and women being less interested in coding, perhaps are playing less video games. It's just not cool as a teenage girl to be into tech. But then it's also a cultural issue that once they get there, nowadays they've got to wear, a hoodie to feel comfortable at work. I mean, that doesn't really sound any different to women having to feel they need to wear power suits back in the 80s to be accepted in the workplace. So somehow that sector in particular, which obviously every job is now interdependent on, with, if you like, is a little bit behind, really, in terms of true equality and diversity in its workforce.
Well, yeah, I mean, we hear about the tech sector really being the new trading floor in terms of the sexism that goes on.
I've heard that quite a lot, and certainly around the discussions at Vogue Codes, which is basically a TED Talk series that we take to Sydney and Melbourne, and we have B2B events, but we also have Vogue Codes Live, which is really aimed at students and 20-year-old young women. And you hear it over and over again. You hear some pretty horrific stories, actually.
I want to go to business leaders because, obviously, in the magazine, you've got some quite, as I say, cerebral articles as well, and you look at business as well. The female business leaders at the moment, for example, if we take Ita Buttrose, who's just been made chair of the ABC, or an Anne Sherry at Carnival, who's very well placed, I would imagine, at NAB to possibly be chair. Are these the sort of women that we're going to look to now? People who obviously are extremely successful in their own right, but they have that ability to, they've got the common touch.
They really do. I mean, Ita is a great example. Before Julie Bishop, there was Ita, right?
Yeah.
We looked up to her.
She's 77.
Exactly. It's still perfectly groomed and looks extraordinary. A highly intelligent woman who does have that ability to cut through. She can be heard, and her messaging is very clear, and Australians trust her. So I think, to have a woman stepping up like that, and at the age she's doing it, is just remarkable. And I do think it changes perceptions. And I think for young women, that's quite remarkable for them to be able to witness.
Some women in recent times have had a really bad time with the media. Things have not gone well for them, but they've come in for a lot of criticism. I mean, just going through recently, Michelle Guthrie, Deborah Thomas, Catherine Brenner, Emma Hazard, not just business but politics. Do you think the amount of criticism was justified, or do you think it's, you go back to someone like John Howard, who was pilloried as well in his time?
Look, I think you've almost got to separate out the two things and say these are women at the top of their game, and they shouldn't have to be treated differently because of their gender, just fairly. And I think that when you are at the top of your game, you are open to criticism, and you have to, stand up for what you've said and take responsibility for it, and obviously the actions of those within an organisation if you're running it. So it's difficult to say on the basis of gender unless there is specific criticism that is directed at their gender, is unfair. I think that it actually just comes with the territory at the top.
Let me ask you about one business that's come in for a bit of flack, hugely glamorous, Victoria's Secret. Now, there are plenty of young girls who go in and buy, and men, of course, but they've come in for rather a lot of flack. What do you make of the story?
Well, they are. I mean, look, they've just gotten rid of their CEO in November last year because of really poor results. Their CMO made a huge error of judgment in an interview, actually with our American sister publication, Vogue, where he said that you would never see a transgender model on his runway ever, and that he would never have plus-size models.
Yes.
And this was all in the context of Rihanna's Savage Fenty lingerie line being released, which was all about this more inclusive message and plus-size models, and she had pregnant models on a runway, and, you know, it was really diverse. And I just think the youth, you know, the youth voted with their feet. They said this is not a brand that we want to engage with anymore, and you can see it in their sales.
Wow. Look, again, culture wars and pushing issues like inclusion. Of course, Anna Wintour was out here earlier this year and made quite a thing of Margaret Court's position.
Yes, that was quite fascinating for us, because we saw two very different responses to what she said about Margaret Court and about the name being on the court. She, with a lot of older...
Margaret Court famously against gay marriage. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of older Australians were really affronted that she would come here and tell us, you know, how to live our lives, or, you know, what to do with our great sporting stars. We found on social media, and we did publish her speech in full, that the overwhelming response of young Australians was, well, I agree with her views about equality and gay marriage, and they didn't see it as necessarily a national affront. It wasn't about nationalism for them.
Yeah,
so
we're with you.
You could really see this divide between, you know, public opinions that sits straight on these sort of two different demographic lines.
Can I ask you finally about workplaces? I mean, workplaces even within our great organisation of News Corp for women are quite different. Do you think it's going to become really important in terms of the jobs that we're selecting as to what's on offer, be it creches or flexible hours, or is that becoming a really important thing?
I think it is unbelievably so, and perhaps a lot of corporations just almost can't keep up with it. I think that the demands that younger staff have of an organisation are far greater than we've ever seen before. I do think post-Me Too, there's a very different attitude in terms of what they should expect and do expect in the workplace. And playing catch-up, I think, is not just a challenge for managers and you know, people like me who are obviously of a different generation, but also of organisations in general.
So interesting to talk to you, Edwina McCann. Thank you.
Thank you.
Edwina McCann there. After the break, we'll get a wrap on markets this week. Michael McCarthy from CMC Markets, Adam Dawes from Shaw & Partners.
You're watching Ticky on Your Money. Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Moving to markets now, and reporting season for the top 200 is pretty much done and dusted. We're now seeing results from some of the smaller companies, including Myer. Yes, it's not the giant that it used to be, is it? Whose results were released earlier this week? Let's get a wrap of the big movers this week. Michael McCarthy from CMC Markets and Adam Dawes from Shaw & Partners join me at the desk. Gentlemen, welcome. Shall we start macro? Michael, the ECB. Now, they've moved. Now, Mario Draghi, whatever it takes?
Still. He's still the central banker.
Yes.
And a personal hero. I think that's become clear over the years. But clearly, central banks around the globe are grappling with the need to talk up markets and maintain an optimistic view of the world and retaining their credibility. And the moves we've seen over the last 6 weeks are exactly what we heard again last night. The ECB lowering its growth forecasts, lowering its outlook, promising that it could once again enter into its long-term lending to support the financial sector. So looking to give markets a boost. Unfortunately, last night it didn't work.
Right. Now, Adam, really interesting on the US side, because when Neil Ferguson was out here this week, the economic historian, he reckons there's been a complete change, not just in the language at the Fed, but the actual framework, and it's more about looking at or assuming that inflation will not kick up and being much more market-driven.
Well, I think Trump has, and the Fed, but Trump has always been market-driven. He's measured his success on what markets have done. You know, I think overall the Chinese need to do a deal. There's lots of things that need to go on with this for it to happen. But we do know Trump next year is going into midterms, or is that the right term? Is that the right? He's
2020.
2020.
Yep.
So he can't lose. He can't now. He's running out of time. So he can't be blustering. He is running out of time. But it is, you're right, the Fed is being more market focused, and I think they have to be to some degree, albeit they have to be independent as well.
But they're assuming that inflation might just rise to slightly above target, but they won't take off again now that they've paused.
Yeah. I think it's fair. You know, it's cheaper to buy goods in America via the internet, Amazon. It is cheaper, so maybe inflation will be stubbornly low.
All right, well, we'll see how we go. Now, let's talk about some stocks. Myer, of course. Well, that was a surprise on the upside.
Well, it was rather. And look, fair play to them. An increase in profit, good news, and an increase in omni-channel sales, whatever the hell that means.
Yes.
However, overall sales still declined 2.8% for the half and 1.4% in the second quarter. So the trend overall, like-for-like sales down 2.3% store for store. So they've still got a major issue. Omni-channel sales still make up less than 10% of overall.
Yeah, this is the online stuff and others and, you know, click and collect, all that sort of stuff.
And it's the future.
Yeah.
And so they need to get
But it's
those
off a low
numbers up.
base, eh?
Very much so. And I think that was what the market was really satisfied with, was that online or omni-channel, that online sales is from a very low base, just starting to tick up. And perhaps that's exactly what an old retail giant needs, is a new, fresh look.
And John King also apparently trying to sort of wriggle with these leases to make them more efficient use of the floor.
Yeah.
Do we think Myer has passed its terrible moment, or?
No.
We don't.
Still feel that there's more to come. Pain.
Market was pricing disaster, now it's just pricing catastrophe.
Oh. Hey, that's very unhelpful. Right, on a brighter note, let's look at some of these changes in the index now, because we've had the March 2019 quarterly rebalance. And welcome Rob Milner at Soul Patts to the top 100.
Yes, well, recognition. And just quietly, Soul Patts trading near its all-time high, and its 40% shareholder Brickworks hitting an all-time high in markets today. So clearly a lot of investors thinking that they might leave their investing in the future to the experts, and they've certainly proved that at Soul Patts.
I was interesting to see Soul Patts. It doesn't trade a lot, so it is low volume, and we like, in the top 100, we like volume. It needs to turn over and things like that.
But now that they're in the top 100, won't certain companies be forced to...
Fund managers, top 100 indexes, yes, we'll have to start playing in that
might actually
space.
get a couple more analysts.
Absolutely, covering the story as well. But I thought
a complicated company.
Very complicated. Lots of sum of parts.
Yes. Yeah. All right, so you reckon we'll stay there?
One current analyst covering the stock at the moment.
Oh, really?
Just for your guide, according to Bloomberg, yes, one.
Yeah. Well, every time I speak to Rob Milner, I have to sort of go back and look at all the cross-shareholdings, and, I mean, it's in everything, isn't it? From TPG to coal to all sorts of different things. So, yeah, fascinating. Now, also on the way out, however, IWF, I guess no surprises there. No surprises there.
Their market cap is pretty much halved in that time, and they've still got a lot of work to do. Well, plus the Royal Commission, they've got a lot of work to do to clean that business up. Stock did rally a little bit over the last couple of months, but wasn't enough to sort of keep it inside of that top 100. And further out, Adam, the top 200 movement as well? Yeah, we've seen some of the technology plays like Hub coming in, and some of the older world stocks like AHG, Automotive Holdings, coming out. So. And Infigen, I see. And Infigen as well, they've had a tough time as well. But there's also a fair bit of consolidation in the 300 of the smaller stuff. Yes. And it won't take effect until the 18th of March, but markets are starting to move on that rebalance as we speak. Yeah, and Michael, we've seen, of course, the banks... they're back in front of Parliament. Well, there's nothing Westpac, CBA. Nothing like a public flogging to get a share price down. And that was the interesting thing about it. I didn't watch the whole coverage, as none of us have the time to do, but from the reports I saw, there wasn't anything that came out today of economic interest. There wasn't anything that I could see that affected bank bottom lines, but it's a great reminder to investors of the political risks of being invested in banks at the moment, and particularly with a federal election in the offing, there's dangers all around. And everyone competing, to
bank bash, to bank bash, yeah.
Exactly.
The only thing that I saw was culture. They're still talking about culture and having to fix that internal culture. But that was the only thing that I could see that really made any kind of news for me.
Yeah,
today.
but they're going to have to show up, aren't they?
Yeah.
Every 6 months, all these CEOs.
Yeah.
So it's going to be an ongoing problem. We're going to see a dip, are we, every time we have one?
I hope not. Markets might become a little bit more desensitised after the third and fourth meeting and whatnot. But yeah, they'll be in front of the spotlight now for another, well, however long.
Yes,
yeah.
however long, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, well, gentlemen, that's a very interesting week we've just had. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
OK, switching to politics now, and the political focus has shifted itself to the economy this week. With weaker than expected growth figures, Labour leader Bill Shorten seized on the sluggish figures to put the focus on his preferred ground, declaring the election referendum on wages. This is the week in politics.
Facing a female problem, Scott Morrison flanked himself with Australia's best female rowers and guaranteed if he wins the election, there'll be a record number of women in cabinet.
I have no problem filling 7 slots for women in my cabinet.
One former female cabinet minister, Julie Bishop, doubling down on her claim that she could have defeated Bill Shorten.
Surely any person who stands for election to lead their party must believe that they could win an election, otherwise you wouldn't stand.
Ahead of International Women's Day, both sides of politics committed more resources to combat domestic violence.
No part of our country is immune from this hideous condition.
There was a big focus this week on the softening economy. The PM warns under Labor it would be worse.
Well, I can't predict how bad things would get under Labor.
Ridiculous, shrill and frankly irresponsible scare campaign.
The Treasurer tried to put a positive spin on the weaker than expected growth figures.
Australia continues to grow faster than any G7 nation except the United States.
There is a per capita, a per head recession.
This is not an economic term that any economist has any recognition of.
Labor leader Bill Shorten tried to shift the focus onto his fairness agenda.
The next election will be a referendum on wages.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister's focus was on border protection, and he even travelled to Christmas Island to make the point. As the election looms, Labor took aim at a string of Liberals appointed to plum government positions and threatened to sack them if elected.
So arrogant have they become that they are already talking about the people they want to sack.
This government is out of control.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Hard demolition can begin at Allianz Stadium immediately after the New South Wales Land and Environment Court rejected a bid to extend an injunction. Charlotte Mortlock reports.
Local Democracy Matters believe that Infrastructure New South Wales will try and rip the hinges off the roof of Allianz Stadium over the weekend. They say that would cause irreparable damage in the 48 hours before the case is appealed in the Supreme Court. The Greens-backed group may now try to get an urgent injunction to stop demolition prior to the hearing. Initially, the temporary injunction was put in place in February, but was always due to expire at 5 p.m. today. Infrastructure New South Wales submitted the delays were costing them $46,000 per day. The $730 million knockdown and rebuild of Allianz Stadium has been one of the most contentious issues in the lead-up to the state election. Charlotte Mortlock, Sky News, Sydney.
After the break, former Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort sentenced to 47 months in prison. We'll get the latest from former White House advisor Ed Blakely next.
This is Ticky on Your Money, covering the big business stories.
Yes, welcome back. Former Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort will be serving 47 months behind bars over fraud. He's set to receive a second sentence next week in a separate case over witness tampering and conspiracy charges he pleaded guilty to last year.
Paul Manafort was sentenced to just under 4 years in prison Thursday for convictions brought on by special counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation.
Mr. Manafort finally got to speak for himself. He made clear he accepts responsibility for his conduct.
Manafort was convicted of 8 counts, including 5 counts of tax fraud, failure to report foreign assets, and defrauding 2 banks. Trump's former campaign chair was facing up to 25 years in prison, a sentence that could have kept him in jail for the rest of his life. As he entered the courtroom in a wheelchair and wearing a green prison jumpsuit, Manafort said to the judge, quote, "The last 2 years have been the most difficult years for my family and I. Humiliated and ashamed would be a gross understatement." Manafort will receive a second sentence next week in a separate case over witness tampering and conspiracy charges he pleaded guilty to last year.
Well, for more on the Manafort case and the latest in US politics, former White House advisor Ed Blakely joins me live at the desk. Ed, great to have you back in here. Now, Paul Manafort, he could have got, what, 25 years?
Yes, he could have.
Was this expected?
No, I did not expect it. I thought he'd get at least 10. And the reason for that is if you look at cases like his, 10 years is usually the minimum.
Why do you think he got off?
Well, I think for 2 reasons. One, he's facing more time. And the judge in this case, if you'll recall, he said early on, this is going after the president, not Mr. Manafort. So the judge showed his hand. This is more than Mitchell got, actually. Remember, in the Nixon administration, Attorney General Mitchell, he got 3 years, and this guy's getting 4. So I don't think there will be an appeal over this sentencing because there's going to be more time.
We'll wait for the next one. Right, okay. Now, you talked about the connections with Donald Trump. I mean, there is some argument to suggest that actually what Manafort is going down for, it's going to be difficult to connect much of it with Trump. Is that right?
Let's look at it this way. Manafort was gone after because he knew things, and the special counsel knew he knew things. He was in that June meeting. He was around the president a lot, and he's around the Russian contacts a lot. So if you put 2 and 2 together, maybe it doesn't add up to 4, but it's pretty close. So I think he was the opening wedge. And a lot of people say, well, this is just a crime that was committed by him, has nothing to do with the president. Why was he the president's campaign manager? He took that job because he could still work with his old contacts. That's what this is all about.
Do you think, Muller, when is this report? Honestly, we're all waiting for this report. When the dickens is it going to come out?
I think it'll come out in the next 2 weeks.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Remember, Rubenstein's gone. He hasn't got anyone to protect him. He's now got every person in the puzzle in some trouble. And the report will probably say something like this, that while the Republican Party didn't initiate this contact, it used it. And that's contrary to federal law. And the president, if he didn't know about it, he should have.
Right.
Because he's officially in charge.
But is that going to be enough to dislodge him?
No, but it's enough for the Democrats in a campaign. They don't want to impeach him.
No.
That would be an awful, ugly struggle.
But I mean, we're getting awfully close to the, 2020 is the...
That's right. It's too close to do this. But the mud is getting awfully thick. Now, the president has to face the possibility of further charges after he leaves the presidency, because the Southern District and the state of New York are lodging very similar charges that Mueller's lodging. And this is why Mueller's relying on them to put enough pressure on the president so maybe he says, I'll give up.
He could, of course, win next year.
Anything can happen.
Yeah. So moving along to the left, to the Democrats, one of the phenomena we've been talking about here is this young lady, young Congresswoman, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who seems to be capturing certainly the left side and increasingly young people within the Democratic Party. Now, she represented her new Green Deal. How much of a problem is she going to present for the Democrats when they're looking to select their candidate?
Well, she's the new Bernie, isn't she?
She is the new Bernie.
But she's bringing the young people along, and the Democrats need the young people. She will get her Green New Deal, but it'll come in the form of an infrastructure bank, which the United States needs.
Right.
It'll be a way of dealing with a lot of this debt, which the United States needs, and it'll also be a way of dealing with unemployment, which will start to rise soon. The U.S. economy is slowing down. So I think she'll get a Green New Deal. The Democrats will embrace that, and they need her because she's a fresh face.
But she's quite left wing, isn't she? Even for the Democrats, she's free this, free that, free healthcare, free education, free, and it's all, you know. Who's
sounds like Bernie.
Well, sounds very like Bernie. But if the mainstream or the ruling Democrat infrastructure, if you like, elects someone that has to pull in a lot of her policies in order to get her support, do they risk losing, say, Trump heartland, which is presumably what they're going for?
Well, I would say this. Trump ran very far to the right. She's very far to the left. Something always comes out in the middle.
Yep.
And there are people we haven't talked about yet.
Who do you reckon might come out?
Well,
on the Democrat side.
On the Democrat side, I still think the Vice President Biden is the candidate. But there's Beto O'Rourke.
He'll come back, will he, Beto?
Beto O'Rourke will come back.
From
He'll
Texas.
be in this campaign someplace.
Yeah.
He's a bright young face. He's very Kennedy-esque. He's very charismatic. But there are a lot of other good women candidates, Harris and others. So I think we have the middle really staked out. That's in the former vice president. The question is, how far to the left do you go? It's so early. Let's not count these chickens until they're really hatched.
Okay, and what about the Republican side?
On the Republican side, there are two possibilities here.
Yeah.
One of them is the president says in his last year, let my people go, meaning his family, and I'll go quietly. And that would make Pence the candidate.
Right.
Automatically.
Right.
The other is the president will run with a woman. And he'll find a woman who's got clean skin who can run with him and hope for the best. But how in the world is he going to get Pennsylvania and Michigan back again? I don't know. I think the left means a lot to people in the United States now because their wages are low and keep going low. You can't talk about unemployment. You have to talk about what does employment give me.
Yes.
It's not giving people very much.
Yes, yes. Well, we've got the Fed, of course, now saying now putting rates on pause. So that presumably helps the economy a bit. What about the trade war at the moment? How do you think Trump is playing that?
Well, he has to get back at that game. Actually, when he was playing it, he wasn't bad.
Yes.
So it's China now. China's the big deal. But the Chinese economy is slowing.
Yes, it is.
And that's a problem for China. They can't really make a very big deal right now. So I think we're going to get something in the middle. The president has to say something, but he's in a very weak position, particularly after North Korea.
Finally, where's the wall?
The wall will be a wall in name only. There'll be something done about border security, but it won't be at the wall.
All right, well, thank you so much for taking us through that from front to back. Ed Blakely, we're really looking forward to 2020. It's going to be very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg says he plans to, quote, pivot to privacy as his company battles the rise of other social networks using encrypted software. The social media giant has come under fire in recent years for its alleged breach of privacy.
Once upon a time, social media felt quite small, almost personal. Then it became a crowd, then something closer to a mob, all very overwhelming. Someone you might not think appreciates this is Mark Zuckerberg. But last night, the Facebook CEO announced a major change to his social network, saying, I believe the future of communication will increasingly shift to private, encrypted services, where people can be confident what they say to each other stays secure, and their messages and content won't stick around forever. Facebook is focusing on messages between groups, rather than posts that can be seen by everyone. Think Facebook as it was in the early days, or WhatsApp, or Instagram, or Facebook Messenger, all of which Facebook owns. To support this vision, Zuckerberg said messages running through his platform would be encrypted, private, even to Facebook, ephemeral, vanishing, so the data doesn't hang around, and also interoperable, which is tech speak for what happens when one app is connected to another. What this means is that WhatsApp, Instagram and Facebook will be joined together. one app to rule them all. Of course, we've been here before. Zuckerberg promised to build private spaces for people to share things. Then came Cambridge Analytica and wave after wave of privacy scandals. The ultimate question is, will people go for it?
After the break, staying with tech, Huawei upping the ante against the US government and not ruling out doing the same in Australia. More on this with the Australian's Chris Griffith next.
Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Well, Huawei has dismissed short-term plans to sue the Australian government over its 5G ban, but hasn't gone as far as to rule out a legal challenge in the future. The company has released a statement saying, whilst we have our differences with the federal government, we would still rather work cooperatively to deliver world-leading technology to Australians. A legal challenge is not a priority at the moment. Huawei Australia is a $650 million business, and our 700 employees continue to serve half the Australian population with a safe and secure technology. But it comes after the Chinese telco announced it is suing the US government over a section of the defence bill. The company claims the National Defence Authorisation Act restricts its business, hurting competition and ultimately consumers. Several countries have moved to block ties with the telco because of a Chinese law requiring companies to cooperate with national intelligence work. But the company stood firm, saying it never has and never will share data with the Chinese government. Well, for more background on this, I spoke with the Australian's tech reporter, Chris Griffith. Chris, you're our resident Huawei watcher. Huge amount of action this week, and I suppose the biggest announcement is this court case against the US government.
It's a fascinating situation, Ticky. The Huawei is, of course, taking action under against Section 889 of the National Defence Authorisation Act about the bans or there. It's really interesting, this, because actually it's the same legislation that Kaspersky challenged, the Russian cyber security.
Tech.
Yeah,
right.
A couple of years back, or a year or so
Was
back.
it successful?
And it failed dismally. And I think Huawei know this, and it's really interesting looking at the game plan that's happening here, because there's a body of opinion out there that Huawei would probably itself knows that it's likely to lose this action.
Yes.
But it's hoping to get a whole lot of information from the court case on, or to find out at least what exactly has the US on it, or claiming to have on it, in terms of security and other issues that have been raised.
So going to the core of why America and perhaps the Western world has a security problem with the use of Huawei technology.
Absolutely, because at the moment, to use, I suppose, a bit like dancing with shadows, they don't know what it is. There's this general claim against Huawei, but they don't know, apart from all the politics that are around it. And there's another couple of reasons why they would have done this, suggesting that is the reason. Firstly, their business in the US isn't all that big. They don't actually provide equipment to the four main carriers there. They do to some of the regional carriers. So it's not as developed in the US as here.
Yes, so why sue?
So why sue? And the other thing is that what my sources say is they're not really so worried about the US market per se, except of course the end where they're depending on components. Of course, it's a huge problem. But the continual, if you like, US government lobbying of a lot of countries against them is really annoying them.
Well, this is really competing for market share, though, isn't it? I mean,
Absolutely.
This is what Huawei's founder was saying, you know, the world needs Huawei. When he came out the other day with his big sort of speech, the world needs Huawei. And is the technology more advanced than American technology?
Well, there's a tweet by Donald Trump that talks about, you know, that the US needs to get ahead in technology and not block technology that's not as advanced, which was quite interesting.
Well, it's also counter to what's happening, if true.
Yes, if true. But I think what really pushed them is that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, was in Hungary, Slovenia and Poland saying this. In the old Eastern Bloc countries that I would imagine don't have that strong, you know, security exchange of information, where this argument about security wouldn't necessarily be that really big to the US in those countries.
So this is really interesting because when I spoke to John Lord, who's chair of Huawei Australia this week, he talked about the ban against that Australia has put on Huawei for 5G being the most extreme of all bans so far. And he said this idea of core and non-core technology that Huawei could really be quite a part of the non-core technology, but Australia's banned them outright.
Yes, well, that debate went on here too, but the Australian Security Services, basically, their argument back was in 5G, it's hard to distinguish the two so easily and isolate the core as such.
Now, as a tech expert, what do you think?
Well, it's hard for me to really know. I mean, you have to know an awful lot about 5G technology. But what I do know is that this government's been talking about building a separate security network anyway. We've had reports of that. So I don't know whether that holds water. But I'd say that when it comes to some of the suburban equipment, just the local antennas and stuff, which is all it's doing is relaying highly encrypted information. If that's all it's does, then encryption really isn't going to be broken
After
at that point.
we're all allowed to have a Huawei phone.
We can, yeah, absolutely. And,
So,
what we give up is usually what we decide to give up on Facebook quite voluntarily. And that there is some concern that maybe Huawei could put a secret switch in there to just turn equipment off. But it seems far-fetched that out of those central areas that there's not a case for having some equipment there, but nevertheless, this is a really interesting move, and I think they are. India was another one that the US lobbied, which is one of their biggest markets in the world.
Yes.
So I think the Chinese are really angry about the US moves rather than necessarily just the local US market.
I suppose the one big difference between Huawei and maybe some of the US tech companies is that Huawei is in the situation where the Chinese government, under law, can command Huawei to help them with a security issue in another country. Now, John Lord was sort of came back on this, said, no, we're quite independent.
Well, I suspect that they would have to. I mean, if that's what the law says. But then again, you can argue this the other way and say maybe, we see our Western security experts wanting to be able to break into encryption, to have special arrangements with Apple and all those companies to do it.
But think of the resistance to actually opening up what happened in a phone as a result of a terrorist instance.
Absolutely,
remember that famous, and the resistance from the private sector.
Yeah. So there is that and we see even at yesterday's press conference the Chinese sort of government hand in the background with our correspondent and a few other correspondents, no doubt. They were sent the same links that we could use on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook to watch the streaming conference. But she was in Beijing covering, of course, the big meet there of the government. But those links don't work in China. So the Chinese, the Great Firewall of China, actually worked against being able for foreign correspondents in China being able to cover
and then at the same time, finally, we've got this other court action going on, this personal action being taken by the Huawei founder's daughter, who's the CFO, against the Canadian government.
Yes, and our readers, and there's others saying, they're very lucky to be able to do that, because if the reverse case, if this was in China, they wouldn't be able to have access to the courts in the same sort of way. But I think in her case, you've got a different imperative, and that is that based on precedents in Canada getting extraditions, they can go on for years. I think, like 10 years or a decade, people will fight extradition because it's easier to fight that than then face the US courts or whatever.
And all this is playing into the current tech war between China and the US.
Yeah, one interesting thing is the Canadians seem to be, even with the problems they're facing with this and some of their citizens under arrest and one facing the death penalty in China, they've held out against this ban so far. It must be, must be wondering what they need to do. But it is gone from what a year ago was a nice little tech discussion that we had about Huawei, through to these concerns about security, through now to world politics. Like there's another view.
And the battle for market share.
Absolutely, the battle for market share. For example, the US might see this as the only weapon it's really got to belt China over its general disregard for privacy and hacking, and that is there any way to really deal with China on this and deal with the trade issues? Well, they've got the Huawei weapon to do it. And so it's not necessarily even security or technology, it's really, global politics at its murkiest in a way.
Very complex. Chris Griffith, thank you so much for making some bits of it clear.
Thank you.
Well, let's finish in Europe now, and the European Central Bank, as we were saying, turning up the monetary policy tap. ECB President Mario Draghi confirming rates will remain on hold until 2020.
We now expect them to remain at their present levels at least through the end of 2019. And in any case, for as long as necessary to ensure the continued sustained convergence of inflation to levels that are below but close to 2% over the medium term.
Yes, the ECB also offering banks a new round of cheap loans to help revive the Eurozone economy. The move underlying how a global trade war, Brexit uncertainty and simmering debt concerns in Italy are taking their toll on economic growth across Europe.
These projections foresee annual rate GDP increasing by 1.1% in 2019, 1.6% in 2020, 1.5% in 2021. Compared with the December 2018 Eurosystem staff macroeconomic projections, the outlook for real GDP growth has been revised down substantially in 2019 and slightly in 2020.
The surprise change of tune causing yields on government bonds to fall and the euro to slip. The move comes as ECB President Mario Draghi prepares to hand over the top job later this year. Whatever it takes, let's hope it doesn't all fall apart then. That's all for the show this week. Join me on Monday for my interview with CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce, April Palmer-Lee. Thanks for your company.